Hello. This is going to be a very, very different video because this is not anything relating to film at all. Um, in some ways, it is because of ultimately what it will mean in the future. But I did a video a while ago where I talked about reading and, my relations to reading. And I said that I was interested at some point at reading books, specifically comics, and I initially thought that I really wasn't into it, um, and a few days ago, I just decided just to take a gamble and just see how I felt after reading a very specific comic. And I just got done reading it, and I figured just to give my thoughts on it real quick, and uh, just to see how, just to give you guys a little, just a little bit of a perspective. And just just to do something different in terms of a video. So I just got done reading in its entirety Supergirl, Woman of Tomorrow. um, and this is my first of basically reading a full comic book. I'd never have actually have done this before, so this is a brand new experience for me. And um, and the book is written by Tom King. I'm not familiar with that name. I took a little glimpse from because I read this off of my Kindle, of my the Kindle app on my phone. I don't have the actual physical copy of the book. Um, Not familiar with him as a writer. I guess he wrote a few things for DC, namely a Superman comic, amongst other things here and there. But Woman of Tomorrow obviously is significant because it is also the inspiration for the upcoming Supergirl movie. So I figured just to familiarize myself with the source material, and also just to um, give myself, a different perspective upon watching the movie. I decided to kind of give my dip, and also just to see how I feel about reading a comic book. I decided to read this. Um, and I mean, there's plenty of other, material out there that I was curious about reading and still might be curious to read in the future, obviously out of the Batman comics and, other things here and there that I would be curious enough to read. Um, but I literally just got done reading this. I took the past few days just to sit down and read it. And I definitely have a lot to say because there are some ups and downs to the book. But ultimately, I do believe that it is an interesting read. Um, but I do have some issues here and there. But I'm just gonna basically kind of talk and ramble. I'm not gonna do what I usually do, um, because I don't want to kind of structure it that way. I just kind of want to let the thoughts fly a little bit. And obviously, for anybody who has not read the book, obviously there will be spoilers ahead. So if you are interested in reading this run, then please, don't watch this video. And obviously, if you also don't want potential spoilers for the upcoming movie, also do not watch this video either. So, as a general consensus, I enjoyed it. I liked the book. I thought it was an interesting read. Um, I thought that the dynamic between Supergirl and this little girl who ultimately is the narrator of the story, as we come to find out later on, she is basically a much older version of herself, detailing events through a book of her own that she would eventually have written. Um, I thought that was kind of neat, kind of an old, classic, type of trope, and how type of stories are told. Um, I thought the dynamic was interesting, if rather distant. Um, and I mean, I thought the imagery itself from the book I thought was just great. I thought lots of great, uh, colorful, expression happening, and uh, I thought to some extent when I first started reading the book, because I'm going to look at my notes by the way, because I got lot of notes that I wrote for the past few days. Um, Upon reading the book the first time, I had kind of like a True Grit vibe going on. Kind of reminded me of that a little bit, where you have this young character that is around people who are much more older and much more weathered, and they have a different perspective of things than of the youthful one. And Supergirl, in this instance, is that older figure, even though she's not like insanely older, than her. She, at least at the point of when the story was being told, because in this story, Supergirl is like 21 years old, as is how they're doing in the film adaptation of this. So she's a very young figure, and Ruther is a little bit young too. They're kind of I think she's like what I think like like 15, 16. I'm not sure if they ever specified on her age, um, but I do like that kind of partnership, even though I do think though it is a bit of a distant relationship. There is a point to it which they do address in the book, but I do think though that distance is a little too much. I think that they could have given themselves a little bit more time to actually get to know each other on a very specific level, rather than Ruther essentially idealizing and worshiping Supergirl to some extent, because it kind of falls into that vein, into their relationship. Um, but and I mean, just talking about Supergirl just on her own, I do like the depiction of her. I think that having this firm but kind of compassionate version of herself, I thought was kind of interesting. Um, and the thing about the book, which getting into my notes a little bit, one of the issues that I had with the book is there's a lot of things um, that are, I don't know if it's just, if this is like a part of an ongoing series that I'm not familiar with, or if this is just its own individual story. Um, but there's a lot of assuming of things, and I just don't really think it really needed to go in that direction. For instance, there's there's points in the book where they make it clear that Supergirl is known across the galaxy, but they never necessarily say for what reason. I understand that she is the cousin to Superman, and there is a relationship to that extent. Um, that may in fact give her more of a popular image, perhaps, but they never really say exactly why. Is it because she is a savior of many planets and many civilizations? That is to be assumed, but they never exactly say that. You know, and I kind of don't like when things are kind of left up to to draw our own conclusions in that regard, and to kind of assume but not necessarily give us full context. If they give us context to who this character is and how she's feeling, she is she's dealing with raw emotions. She's very very attached to the concept of pain. Like the book a lot of the times is showing Supergirl vulnerable and getting hurt, and in some ways inviting that pain. There's a really, one of my favorite moments in the book, kind of just finishing up, was Supergirl falling down to the earth, down to this planet, and and she's like becoming like entering the atmosphere, and she's heating up. She's getting into almost incoming and engulfed into flames, and she's kind of cozy in it. She's kind of comfortable with it, and in some ways, at least to how it's insinuated in the book, it's almost as if that Supergirl was willing to die in that moment because of how she's feeling on the inside, but then snaps back out of it because she realizes that there's more at stake than her own self. Um, and it's stuff like that I found interesting about the character. I liked the framework of her mental state. She is a stoic, character, but she also is a character that is on the inside dealing with a lot. It's just she doesn't express it a lot on the outside. I don't mind the framework of the feminism that is taking shape. I mean, this is, obviously, to some extent, with how the book is being told, it's, all the bad guys are essentially, men, and there's something being fed there. I didn't take issue with it because it doesn't take the like full precedence in the book. It's not something that kind of dictates the entire read. But it is there. It is a subtext. You can definitely read into it. In some ways, I do agree though or I will acknowledge that it does feel corded. It doesn't feel exactly like well integrated. At times, it does feel like we are just kind of allowing that message to be the forefront. But a lot of times, it just is the subtext. It's just something to understand as a layering of its idea of what it's trying to get at. Um, but ultimately, um, there are things that are kind of just thrown in the book, which I said like kind of are left up to assumptions. I would think. Like there's this horse that shows up at one point, and they never explain where that thing comes from. At least from what I read. Maybe I need to revisit a page or two, but I don't recall them explaining what happened to the horse. Like what? How did that? Where did the horse come from? We know what happens to the horse, but and we know a little bit more about the horse later on. Um, but where did the horse come from, and why does it have a specific relationship to Supergirl? Like it just seemed as though that like there was a need for certain things to happen to get us to capturing the villain so that we can round out the message of the book, which essentially the message of the book, which I found to be kind of interesting, was that the gray, the nuances in between doing the right thing and also doing the wrong thing, understanding, you know, the good and the bad, and then the one of the things I didn't agree with the book, which I felt kind of undermined it or kind of brought that message down a little bit, was that Supergirl's whole thing about going on this quest was Crypto was injured by this character, this villain, Krim of the Yellow Hills. Uh, that was her kind of her stepping off point. It seemed to be for her to go on this mission, and it's revealed uh, that Crypto was actually fine, and that Supergirl essentially lied because she ultimately wanted to teach Ruther, the little girl that we follow in the book, she ultimately wanted to teach her a lesson in showing her all the violence that Krim does, because Krim is part of this group of they're called the Brigards. I think that's how you say it, and their whole thing is about slaughtering worlds. They're not. They're basically a genocidal group. They just they take pleasure in violence, and they take uh, they take pride in that also. Um, and I think that, and upon showing her this, because Ruther, her whole thing about in the book is to get Crown of the Yellow Hills because he is responsible for killing her father, and she is on her quest of revenge. And I believe that the point of what Supergirl was trying to do was show her that the cycle of violence will always continue if violence is allowed. And if you allow yourself to kill Krim of the Yellow Hills, you're only allowing the cycle of violence to continue. And I thought that that was a neat little message, and I think that kind of exposing that Supergirl basically had lied, and the motivation to bring Ruther along was ultimately kind of a selfish one. Like it kind of underpins it. I don't know if that's the word. Like it just kind of undermines the idea behind it. Because Supergirl herself also almost decides to kill Krim at a critical moment, and it's Ruther who brings Supergirl back upon realizing what Supergirl was trying to do with her the entire time. Um, you know, Stuff like that. I just felt like was like I don't really know. Like, it just felt a little messy in that way, in that spirit, or in that sort of way that they navigated that story, or at least that specific part of that story. Um, and then we get to the end, and the end of the story, we have Supergirl and Ruther deciding not to kill Krim, and then Supergirl says, "It's too big, and we're too small." And then, many years later, we find Ruther, who's now much older, and we realize that the narration the entire time was from her. And Supergirl and Crypto visit her. They have like a new look and stuff like that. And we find out that Krim has been actually spending time in the Phantom Zone, which is basically like space jail, for hundreds of years now. And he's now turned a new leaf. He's much better now. He's regretful. He's guilt driven, or he feels guilty for his actions, and he's released. And he meets older Ruther and Supergirl, and he appears to have had a change of heart. He appears to be has changed for the better. And Krim, begs for forgiveness. And it seems, at least when I first saw it, it looked to me that Ruther had killed him. Now, if when I thought that the first time, I thought, okay, that really went against what they were setting up in this book. But then I looked into it and I thought, just see if I what I thought was correct. Turns out that she didn't kill him, she just knocked him out. And I looked at the actual book. I'll put a image here so you guys can see. Um, his hand moves like this, so he's like actually catching his head. So all really did was knock him out. And coincidentally, in the same exact spot where her father was murdered by him. And in that sort of context, ending the cycle of violence, essentially, but holding on to what's true and not looking for forgiveness, basically doing the right thing, um, taking the good with the bad, you know. Um, I do like that. I do like that. I just think that some of the navigation in that story, to some extent, is a little messy, but also at the same time a little bit long-winded because half of the book is basically Supergirl and Ruther going from planet to planet and exploring things, throughout each of these planets, seeing just the hardships, the nasty things about people, the rude or mean spirited type of figures, to innocents, the people who are just doing their own thing, and to understand ultimately Supergirl's agenda with this, you can glean an interesting idea here in the book. I just think that idea to some extent is long-winded, and I think that if they had crunched it a little bit more in terms of just you know how long, because it's over 200 pages, I don't think that it necessarily needed to go for that long. um, and also giving time to properly explain other elements to where it feels warranted. Like I said, that horse just shows up out of nowhere. um, Supergirl being how big she is, I feel leaving it without explanation is just ultimately uh, letting the name stand on its own, which I don't necessarily think is you know, I don't necessarily think is completely warranted. Um, but I mean, overall, though, I mean, it's an interesting read. Um, I do like, at some points how it is literally written. There's some great lines, specifically, with some lines revolving around the concepts about death and uh, and the purpose of living. Stuff like that. I found to be nice, and the way it was told. I just think though that the overall book is a little long-winded. I think that if you were to cut it down and cut out the fat of what they're trying to get at, and just make it more condensed, I think then I would have been won over a lot more. As it stands, I mean, I did like it, but I can't sit here and say that I loved it. Um, so it's a good read. I think that there are some good things there. Definitely, I mean, visually, I mean, just what you're literally looking at, it's really at some points really great. Um, and like I said, I do like, ultimately how they depict Supergirl. She is very different to Superman, where that she does stand for the same morals, but her attitudes and her overall demeanor is a bit different compared to Superman. She still has that compassion, she still has that care that Superman carries, but she has this guilt. She has this this willingness to to be what is it? To be not cruel, but to be pitiful, I guess, at some points. Like she's not one to really be tested. As much as Superman is, she's Supergirl is one to not really be tested with because of all of what she carries with her in terms of a past. So so I do there are good things here. There are good things here. I just think though that that story could have been told a little bit shorter, if you ask me. But generally a good read. I did find myself in. I mean, obviously, I kept reading it. I dedicated these days to read it, so obviously, it had some effect. But I do believe that some more room to allow things to flourish and to be explained, and less so of basically kind of you know uh, basically chasing its own tail to some extent. I feel then would have felt a lot more impactful. Um, but as it stands, it's a decent read. There's just things here and there, story wise, that I take issue with, and literal elements that I feel are just kind of thrown in there, either for like visual value or maybe there's things there comic book wise that I'm just not familiar with. But yeah, it'll definitely be interesting to see how they uh, choose to illustrate this on the big screen. There's obviously some big differences here. For starters, obviously Lobo is not in the book. I was waiting for Lobo to show up. I was because when they said bounty, I was just thinking the entire time I was like, well, okay, Lobo will probably show up at some point, right? No, Lobo does not actually appear in the book, so that's already a big difference in and of itself. Um, so we'll see how they handle crypto. That will be interesting if they actually tried to mirror a certain effect. I do hope, though, just to say, I do hope that there are changes. I don't wish for this to be one for one because I think that some things, like the whole idea of Supergirl basically lying, to serve a certain kind of to basically present a certain point. I don't like that. I would have preferred if she actually had her own agenda, an actual real agenda attached to her actions, and not just, hey, I'm just gonna do these things because I kind of need a vent, or I kind of need to let off some steam, and also while doing so, have a message there. Like, I don't know. I hope that stuff like that is changing, and there will be changes, but hopefully good changes because it is, in my opinion, a bit flawed in terms of an overall book, but a good read, but definitely room for improvement in some areas, in my opinion. But those are my thoughts on the book. I liked it, and we'll see if I, choose to indulge again on another comic or another book, and we'll see if maybe if we're for another doing another video. But that's it, guys. Just wanted to spout out my thoughts for a little bit on my first real read. And yeah, if you guys have read the book, let me know. How do you guys feel about the book, and how do you guys feel it will, uh, how it will be translated to the big screen? Let me know. Let me know all your thoughts in the comment section below. And that's gonna be it for this video, guys. Thank you guys for tuning in. And until then, I'll catch you guys in the next video. Bye.